Jason Carter, the revered CEO of Bright Edge Corporation, Seattle's beacon of innovation, pulled the hood of his jacket tighter around his face as he stepped into the sleek, glass-fronted skyscraper that housed his company. His polished appearance and commanding aura had been swapped for a nondescript ensemble of scuffed shoes, faded jeans, and a thrift store jacket. This was not the Jason Carter the world knew. Today, he was simply Joseph Carter, an applicant for the junior analyst position. Rumors of bias and prejudice within Bright Edge's hiring process had reached him in whispers from trusted confidants and anonymous emails. These whispers hinted at systemic racism and a culture of dismissiveness toward applicants with unconventional backgrounds. It gnawed at Jason, who had worked tirelessly to build a company that championed inclusivity. If the rumors were true, they undermined everything Bright Edge claimed to stand for. Jason's plan was as audacious as it was simple. Go incognito, apply for a position, and uncover the truth firsthand. He had meticulously crafted a fake resume that hinted at competence but lacked the prestige associated with Ivy League education. He was a single father with a year-long employment gap. The reception area gleamed, the epitome of modern corporate sophistication. The receptionist, a young woman with carefully curated neutrality on her face, glanced at him with mild disinterest. Jason felt the weight of her gaze pause at his mismatched attire and noticed her eyes dart toward the more sharply dressed candidates nearby. "Name?" she asked curtly, her smile disappearing the moment he answered. After a few keystrokes, she handed him a badge-marked visitor, with a subtle sigh that seemed reserved for troublesome guests. As Jason sat in the waiting area, a steady stream of suited, white, and predominantly male applicants filled the room. He overheard fragments of their conversations, references to elite universities, country clubs, and shared vacation spots that sounded more like a social club than a group of job seekers. A young black woman in a crisp blazer walked in. The receptionist's posture stiffened, and her tone cooled noticeably. Jason watched, his heart sinking as the woman was peppered with questions about her resume and told to wait for further clarification, despite clearly having an appointment. Meanwhile, a middle-aged white man who had arrived late was immediately ushered into an interview room without so much as a glance at his credentials. Jason's turn came. He entered a room where 3 interviewers sat, their body language ranging from casual disinterest to barely veiled skepticism. 2 were white men. The third, an Asian woman, seemed more focused on taking notes than making eye contact. "So, Mr. Carter," one of the men, Dan, began, his tone teetering on condescension, "your resume says you worked as a data analyst for a year at a startup. No offense, but that's a bit light for someone applying here." Jason explained his employment gap, mentioning his time spent as a caregiver for his child, emphasizing his commitment to rebuilding his career. Dan smirked. "Admirable," he said flatly, before quickly moving on. The Asian woman nodded perfunctorily, but didn't press further. The questions that followed became increasingly dismissive. "Do you think your experience at, what's it called?" "Oh yes, Delta Data Solutions," Dan said, elongating the name mockingly, "prepares you for a firm like this?" Jason felt his hands clench under the table. He responded calmly, citing specific achievements, but the interviewers seemed uninterested in his answers. They interrupted him frequently, their questions veering off-topic or laced with skepticism about his ability to fit in with the corporate culture. The interview took a sharp turn when one interviewer, an older white man named Richard, commented, "We're looking for people who can handle the fast pace here. Single fathers often struggle with balancing priorities. Just a thought?" Jason felt the blood drain from his face. He responded evenly, but his stomach churned. After the interview, he lingered in the hallways, pretending to look for the restroom but really observing. He saw the young black woman leave, her head held high despite the whispered snickers of 2 employees near the elevator. "Quota higher," one of them murmured, loud enough to make Jason's heart pound with anger. When he returned to the reception area, he noticed Dan escorting the late white applicant from earlier. They laughed and shook hands. "We'll fast-track your application," Dan said warmly, patting him on the back. As Jason exited the building, a wave of emotions crashed over him. Anger, shame, disappointment. He had built Bright Edge to stand as a monument to merit and equality, Yet here it was, a fortress of implicit biases and exclusion. For the first time in his illustrious career, Jason felt small, but he also felt resolve. This wasn't just an issue to be addressed. It was a battle to be fought. Tomorrow, Jason Carter would return, not as Joseph Carter, but as the CEO, ready to expose and dismantle the culture of discrimination festering within his own company. Jason Carter arrived at the next stage of the interview process, determined to press on despite the humiliation he'd endured earlier. Miss Taylor, the hiring manager, was waiting in a pristine office, the decor carefully curated to scream success. Jason adjusted his tie, slightly frayed but clean, and took a deep breath before entering. Miss Taylor was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. She barely looked up from her laptop as he walked in. "Mr. Carter, please, take a seat," she said, her tone clipped. Her eyes flicked up for a brief moment, scanning his worn suit and tired shoes, before returning to the glowing screen in front of her. "Thank you for this opportunity," Jason began, his voice steady. She waved a hand dismissively. "Let's get to it," she said, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "I've reviewed your resume. It's unconventional." The pause hung heavy in the air, a thinly veiled judgment. Jason maintained his composure, though his pulse quickened. "Unconventional can sometimes mean innovative," he offered, attempting to steer the conversation positively. Miss Taylor's lips twitched into something resembling a smile, but her eyes remained cold. "Perhaps. But let's talk about the gaps in your employment. A whole year? That's concerning. What exactly were you doing during that time?" Jason explained, once again, how he had stepped away to care for his child. He emphasized the skills he'd honed during that period, time management, adaptability, but Miss Taylor didn't seem convinced. "I see," she said, leaning back in her chair. "It's admirable, sure, but our company culture is high-paced, demanding. Do you think you're ready to jump back into such an environment after so much time away?" Jason suppressed the flare of anger that threatened to rise. "I'm more than ready," he replied firmly. "In fact, I've been preparing for this transition for months. I've taken advanced certifications, worked on independent projects, and stayed informed on industry trends." Miss Taylor nodded slowly, but her expression remained skeptical. "Interesting," she said. "But we're also looking for someone who can integrate seamlessly into our team. Fit is just as important as skill, Mr. Carter." Jason hesitated. Fit was a word he'd heard before in professional settings, often wielded as a subtle weapon against those who didn't look or think like the majority. He decided to address it head-on. "Could you clarify what you mean by fit?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Miss Taylor blinked, as if surprised by his directness. "It's about the company's vibe, its energy," she said vaguely. "We pride ourselves on a cohesive, forward-thinking environment. Sometimes people with certain backgrounds can struggle to adapt." "Certain backgrounds?" Jason repeated, his voice now edged with steel. Miss Taylor's cheeks flushed slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I mean professional backgrounds," she said, though her hesitation betrayed her. "For example, your experience at Delta Data Solutions. It's not exactly on par with the caliber of firms we usually recruit from." Jason felt the sting of the comment, but refused to falter. "My work at Delta Data involved handling complex datasets and driving key insights for our clients. I've worked with teams to create scalable solutions under tight deadlines. I assure you, my experience is both relevant and valuable." Miss Taylor smiled thinly. "I'm sure you believe that," she said. "But, let's be honest, the culture here at Bright Edge is unique. It's not just about what you've done but about how you present yourself. People need to feel comfortable working with you." Jason's stomach churned. He saw the young black woman from the previous stage of interviews flash through his mind, her confident stance chipped away by a similar conversation. Was this what she had endured as well? "I see," Jason said, his voice cool. "And what exactly about me would make people uncomfortable?" Miss Taylor's pen paused mid-note. "Let's not make this personal," she said lightly. "It's just a consideration we have to weigh." Jason leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "It feels personal when assumptions are made about my ability to fit in without clear justification." Miss Taylor shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. I assure you, Mr. Carter, we apply the same standards to everyone. Jason's eyes narrowed. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like certain standards are being applied disproportionately. The tension in the room thickened. Miss Taylor's expression hardened, her professional facade cracking just slightly. I think we've discussed enough for now, she said, closing her laptop. We'll be in touch. Jason rose, his mind racing with anger and disappointment. Thank you for your time, he said, his tone clipped. He turned and walked out, feeling the eyes of staff on him as he passed through the hallway, some curious, others dismissive. In the elevator, he exhaled deeply. This was worse than he'd imagined. The systemic issues within Bright Edge were not confined to whispers and rumors. They were embedded in the very fabric of its hiring process. But Jason wasn't leaving defeated. He now had first-hand evidence of the problem, and he was more determined than ever to address it. The battle wasn't over. For Jason Carter, it was just beginning. Jason sat stiffly as Miss Taylor continued, her words laced with a veneer of corporate diplomacy that failed to mask the underlying biases he had come to expose. Her tone, sharp but deliberately composed, carried an air of finality that made the rejection she was building toward unmistakable. So, Mr. Carter, she began, tapping her pen lightly against her pristine notebook, one of the key aspects of working at Bright Edge is our emphasis on synergy. We strive to create teams that not only excel individually, but also align seamlessly with our shared vision. Jason nodded, sensing where this was headed, but choosing to remain calm. I completely agree, he said. In my previous roles, I've always prioritized collaboration and building rapport within my teams. Miss Taylor gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. Yes, I see that on your resume, she said, flipping through pages as though searching for something to support her skepticism. However, synergy isn't just about working well with others. It's about a deeper connection, a shared energy that fosters innovation. It's something intuitive. Jason's chest tightened. Words like intuitive were often wielded to excuse hiring decisions based on personal comfort rather than merit. He decided to challenge her tactfully. Could you elaborate on how you measure synergy? He asked, keeping his voice steady. I'd love to understand what specific qualities you're looking for. Miss Taylor hesitated, a flicker of irritation flashing across her face before she recovered. It's difficult to quantify, she admitted. It's more about a feeling we get during the interview process. An alignment with our vision, if you will. Jason tilted his head slightly, meeting her gaze head-on. I see. And do you feel my qualifications or my responses during this process suggest a lack of alignment? Her expression hardened, and she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. You're clearly capable, Mr. Carter, she said, her tone implying a but that Jason could almost see hanging in the air. However, at Bright Edge, we look beyond capability. We're looking for individuals who represent the ethos of our brand, who embody the spirit of our company. And you believe I don't embody that spirit? Jason pressed, his voice calm but edged with steel. Miss Taylor's lips tightened, the lines around her mouth deepening. It's not about you, specifically, she said, her words carefully chosen but no less cutting. It's about ensuring the team feels cohesive. Sometimes, that means making tough decisions. The words landed like a punch to the gut, but Jason kept his expression neutral. He leaned forward slightly, refusing to let her dismiss him without further accountability. Miss Taylor, I'd like to understand what you mean by cohesive. Is there something about my background or my experiences that you feel might disrupt that cohesion? Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jason thought she might lose her composure. But she quickly masked her irritation with a practiced smile. This isn't personal, Mr. Carter, she said, her tone patronizing. I simply don't believe this is the right fit. The word fit hung in the air, heavy and damning. Jason had heard it too many times before, often used to exclude individuals who didn't conform to an unspoken standard. He felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but he refused to let it show. I see, he said evenly, rising to his feet. I appreciate your time and the opportunity to learn more about Bright Edge. Miss Taylor stood as well, extending a hand that Jason shook briefly. "We'll be in touch," she said, though her tone made it clear no such contact would be forthcoming. Jason exited the office, his jaw clenched tightly. As he walked through the brightly lit hallways of the company he had built from the ground up, he couldn't shake the feeling of injustice that coursed through him. He passed the young black woman he had seen earlier, now standing near the elevators with a defeated expression. Their eyes met briefly, and Jason saw a reflection of his own frustration in hers. When he reached the street, the cold Seattle air hit him like a slap, but it did little to cool his anger. The humiliation of being dismissed, not because of his qualifications, but because of biases wrapped in vague corporate jargon, burned deeply. Jason pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The voice on the other end was that of his assistant, reliable and efficient. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to schedule an emergency meeting with HR and the executive team tomorrow morning. No exceptions." "Of course, Mr. Carter," Emily replied, her tone immediately alert. "Is everything okay?" Jason looked up at the Bright Edge logo gleaming on the building above him. "Not yet," he said, his jaw tightening. "But it will be." As he hung up, Jason allowed himself a moment to reflect. The battle ahead would be fierce, and the change required would shake the very foundations of the company. But he was ready. For every candidate like himself and the young woman he had seen, for every voice silenced by the vague promises of synergy and fit, Jason would ensure that Bright Edge lived up to its name. It would become a beacon of fairness and opportunity, no matter how much it cost him personally. He turned away from the building, his resolve solidified. The fight had only just begun. Jason stepped out of the interview room with Miss Taylor, the echoes of her dismissive tone lingering in his mind. But instead of heading toward the elevator that would take him back to the bustling streets of Seattle, he veered toward the express lift leading to the top floor, the CEO's office. The floor where decisions were made, and the culture of Bright Edge was supposedly shaped. As the elevator doors closed, Jason pressed the button for the 45th floor, his reflection staring back at him from the polished steel walls. He loosened his tie slightly, his mind racing with what he would say. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every qualified candidate who had been turned away under the guise of fit and synergy. When the doors opened, Jason was greeted by the hushed opulence of the executive suite. The wide glass windows framed a panoramic view of Seattle, the city shimmering under a gray sky. His assistant, Emily, was already waiting, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Jason in his deliberately worn disguise. "Mr. Carter," she said, quickly regaining her composure. "I've gathered the executive team as you requested. They're waiting in the boardroom." Jason nodded, his jaw tightening. "Let's not keep them waiting." He strode into the boardroom, his steps purposeful. The room was already filled with Bright Edge's top executives, including the head of HR, the COO, and several department heads. They all glanced up as Jason entered, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to confusion at his unrecognizable appearance. Jason, the COO, a balding man named Robert, was the first to speak. "What's going on? Why are you dressed like someone interviewing for an entry-level position at this company?" Jason interrupted, his voice cutting through the room. "That's because I was." The room fell silent. Robert's confusion deepened, and a few executives exchanged uneasy glances. The head of HR, a poised woman named Linda, adjusted her glasses nervously. "I've spent the last few days going through our hiring process as an outsider," Jason began, his tone even but laced with tension. "I've experienced firsthand what candidates face when they walk into Bright Edge, and let me tell you, it's nothing short of appalling." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Linda cleared her throat. "Jason, I'm not sure I understand. What exactly are you saying?" Jason turned his gaze toward her, his eyes blazing with frustration. "I'm saying that our hiring process is riddled with biases. I've seen capable candidates dismissed not because of their qualifications, but because of vague notions of fit and synergy. I've seen implicit racism and classism masquerading as professionalism." "Racism?" Robert interjected, his tone defensive. "That's a serious accusation." Jason shot him a cold look. "It's not an accusation. It's a fact." I saw it when a black candidate with impeccable credentials was kept waiting while others were fast-tracked. I heard it in the condescending tone of our hiring managers when they spoke to candidates who didn't look or sound like the typical Bright Edge employee. The room grew tense, the weight of Jason's words pressing down on the assembled executives. Emily entered quietly and placed a folder in front of Jason. He opened it, revealing notes he had taken during his interviews and observations. I was interviewed by Miss Taylor, Jason continued, his voice steady but charged. Despite my qualifications and clear ability to excel in the role, I was dismissed because I didn't fit the company culture. She used terms like synergy and vision alignment as thinly veiled excuses to exclude me. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Jason, our managers are trained to look for candidates who align with the company's values. Surely you can understand that. What I understand, Jason said sharply, is that those values are being twisted to perpetuate exclusion. Our culture isn't built on excellence and innovation. It's built on sameness, on comfort, and that comfort is rooted in biases that we refuse to acknowledge. He paused, letting his words sink in. The executives looked uneasy, some fidgeting, others avoiding eye contact. Jason pressed on, his voice rising slightly. We claim to value diversity, but it's just lip service. How many people of color hold senior positions here? How many employees come from non-traditional backgrounds? We've created a system that weeds out anyone who doesn't conform to a narrow, outdated mold. Robert leaned forward, his face red. That's not fair, Jason. We've worked hard to build a strong team. A strong team that looks exactly the same, Jason shot back. Tell me, Robert, when was the last time we hired someone who didn't graduate from a top-tier school? Or someone who had a career gap for personal reasons? When was the last time we took a chance on someone who didn't fit the typical profile? The room fell silent again, the weight of Jason's challenge hanging heavily. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each executive. This isn't just about doing the right thing, he said, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its urgency. It's about survival. If we don't change, we'll become obsolete. Innovation thrives on diversity, of thought, of experience, of perspective. Without it, we stagnate. Linda nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. What do you propose? Jason took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. First, an immediate review of our hiring practices. We need to identify and eliminate biases at every stage. Second, mandatory training for all hiring managers to address unconscious bias. And third, a commitment to measurable diversity goals at every level of the company. The room was silent as Jason finished, his words hanging in the air. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice subdued. You're right, he admitted. We've been blind to this for too long. Jason nodded, his jaw relaxing for the first time. Then let's fix it. Together. As he left the boardroom, Jason felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. Bright Edge could still become the beacon it was meant to be, and he would lead the way. Miss Taylor walked into the executive boardroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her usual confidence replaced by visible unease. She had been summoned abruptly, and the formal tone of the email left little room for interpretation. This was no ordinary meeting. When she stepped inside, her eyes widened. The entire executive team was seated around the large mahogany table, their expressions serious. At the head of the table sat Jason Carter, his disguise gone, now dressed in a sharp suit that commanded attention. Mr. Carter? Miss Taylor stammered, her voice rising in surprise. Jason's gaze locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. Miss Taylor, he began. His tone measured but firm. Please, take a seat. As she sank into the chair closest to the door, the tension in the room was palpable. Miss Taylor glanced around, clearly searching for some clue as to what this was about, but the faces around the table offered no answers. Jason let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. You seem surprised to see me here, he said, his voice calm but with an edge that hinted at the storm beneath. Miss Taylor nodded, trying to regain her composure. I am. I didn't expect, she trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the executives. What's going on? Jason leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "What's going on," he said, "is that I spent the past few days experiencing Bright Edge's hiring process firsthand. As a candidate," her face paled, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Jason held up a hand to stop her. "Let me finish. I wanted to see for myself if the rumors I'd heard about bias and exclusion in our hiring practices were true. And, Miss Taylor, you gave me all the confirmation I needed." A murmur ran through the room, but Jason silenced it with a sharp glance. He turned back to Miss Taylor, who was now sitting stiffly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "During our interview," Jason continued, "you questioned my ability to fit in with the company culture. You used phrases like synergy and vision alignment to justify dismissing my qualifications. I want to give you the opportunity now to explain exactly what you meant by that." Miss Taylor's lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. I don't understand what you're accusing me of," she said finally, her voice defensive. Jason's eyes narrowed. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Miss Taylor. I'm asking you to clarify your own words. What exactly about my background, my appearance, or my experience led you to believe I wouldn't fit?" She glanced around the room, her discomfort growing under the weight of the collective gaze. "It wasn't personal," she said quickly. "We have a specific culture at Bright Edge, and it's important to find candidates who align with that." Jason leaned back, his expression icy. "And what, in your view, defines that culture?" "It's about teamwork, collaboration, and shared values," she replied, her tone almost pleading. "We're looking for people who can integrate seamlessly, who look a certain way." Jason interrupted, his voice cutting through her explanation like a knife. "Who come from a certain background? Because that's what it sounded like when you dismissed my qualifications without offering a valid reason." "That's not what I meant," Miss Taylor protested, her cheeks flushing. "Then what did you mean?" Jason demanded, his tone rising slightly. "Because I can tell you what it felt like. It felt like a polite way of saying I didn't belong. And I wasn't the only one." He gestured toward Emily, who nodded and handed him a folder. Jason opened it and began reading. "I've spoken to other candidates, including a highly qualified black woman who was made to wait for over an hour while less qualified candidates were given priority. Her name was subtly butchered by the receptionist and joked about afterward. She was told the same thing I was. You're capable, but we don't think you're a good fit." Miss Taylor's face turned crimson, her composure crumbling. I didn't know about that," she stammered. "But you knew what you said to me," Jason shot back, his voice steady but filled with cold fury. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you used coded language to justify your biases. Did you honestly believe it wouldn't come to light?" "I was following procedure," Miss Taylor blurted out, her voice rising. "The hiring process is designed to perpetuate exclusion." Jason interrupted again, his words sharp. "To weed out anyone who doesn't conform to an unspoken standard. And that standard, Miss Taylor, is deeply flawed." Linda, the head of HR, spoke up for the first time. "Miss Taylor," she said, her voice measured, "do you understand the implications of your actions? This isn't just about Mr. Carter's experience. It's about the culture we've allowed to take root in our hiring practices. A culture that clearly doesn't align with the values we claim to uphold." Miss Taylor sank lower in her chair, her usual confidence shattered. "I didn't mean to." "But you did," Jason said, cutting her off. "And it stops now. Effective immediately, our hiring process will be overhauled. There will be no more room for vague, subjective criteria like fit. Candidates will be evaluated based on merit and potential, nothing else." He stood, his presence commanding the room. "Miss Taylor, you have a choice to make," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You can either be part of this change, or you can step aside." The room was silent, the weight of Jason's words hanging heavily in the air. Miss Taylor looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I want to help," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded, though his expression remained stern. "Then prove it. Because from this moment on, Bright Edge will become the company it was meant to be. A place where talent and innovation are valued above all else." As the meeting adjourned, Jason lingered for a moment, watching the executives file out. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and it would begin with him. Jason remained standing at the head of the boardroom table, his presence commanding the attention of every executive in the room. The tension was palpable, the weight of his revelations and accusations still settling heavily over everyone. Miss Taylor sat silently, her earlier confidence replaced with a subdued humility as Jason shifted his focus from her to the broader issue. "This is not just about Miss Taylor," Jason began, his tone firm but measured. "What happened to me and other candidates is not the fault of a single individual. The problem is systemic. It's a culture and process that allows bias, whether implicit or explicit, to influence decisions. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a failure of leadership. My leadership." The executives exchanged uneasy glances, but Jason pressed on. "I created this company with the vision of inclusivity, of innovation driven by diverse perspectives. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. We became complacent, allowing comfortable habits and unexamined biases to creep into our processes. That ends now." He turned to Emily, who handed him a stack of papers. Jason distributed them around the table, each executive receiving a detailed action plan he had prepared. "Here's what's going to happen," Jason said, his voice unwavering. "Effective immediately, we are implementing a comprehensive overhaul of our hiring practices and workplace culture. First, all hiring managers and executives will undergo mandatory training on unconscious bias. This isn't optional. It's required for anyone involved in recruitment or management." Miss Taylor flinched slightly but said nothing. "Second," Jason continued, "we will establish complete transparency in the hiring process. This includes publishing our diversity metrics, not just for internal accountability but for public scrutiny. We need to hold ourselves to the highest standard, and that means owning our failures." A few executives shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the prospect of such public exposure. Jason anticipated this and met their unease with steely resolve. "Third," he said, "we are launching an anonymous feedback system. Candidates, employees, and even customers will have a direct line to report concerns about bias, discrimination, or any behavior that goes against our values. And let me be clear, every report will be investigated thoroughly. There will be no sweeping things under the rug." The room was silent as Jason took a step back, letting his words sink in. Then he turned his attention back to Miss Taylor. "Miss Taylor," he said, his tone softening but remaining firm, "you have a decision to make. You can leave this company if you believe you're not ready or willing to embrace these changes. Or you can stay, admit your mistakes, and commit to being part of the solution." Miss Taylor swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. She looked up at Jason, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "I've made mistakes, serious mistakes, and I take full responsibility for them. But I believe in what this company stands for, and I want to be part of making it right." Jason studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. But words aren't enough, Miss Taylor. I'll be watching your actions closely. This is about more than one person's redemption. It's about rebuilding trust with every candidate and employee who's ever felt excluded or dismissed." Miss Taylor nodded, her face solemn. "I understand," she said, "and I won't let you down." Jason shifted his focus back to the room. "This isn't going to be easy," he said. "Change never is. But if we're serious about being the industry leader we claim to be, we need to lead by example. We need to show the world that Bright Edge is not just a company, but a beacon of fairness and opportunity." The impact of Jason's initiative was swift and far-reaching. Within weeks, Bright Edge rolled out its new hiring processes. Employees underwent mandatory training, and the anonymous feedback system quickly became a trusted platform for raising concerns. The transparency and diversity metrics earned the company praise, and candidates who once would have been overlooked now found themselves with genuine opportunities to succeed. Miss Taylor, true to her word, became one of the most vocal advocates for the new system. She personally mentored candidates from diverse backgrounds and used her own missteps as a cautionary tale in training sessions. Her transformation earned her the respect of both colleagues and employees. Bright Edge's efforts didn't go unnoticed. The company's initiative was covered in major industry publications, with headlines lauding its commitment to equity and inclusion. Other firms, inspired by Bright Edge's success, began adopting similar measures, sparking a ripple effect across the corporate landscape. Jason, however, remained focused on the work ahead. During a company-wide meeting, he addressed his employees with the same passion he had brought to the boardroom. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice resonating through the auditorium. "We've set a new standard, but the real challenge is maintaining it. This isn't about policies. It's about people. It's about creating a culture where everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, feels valued and empowered to succeed." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Jason didn't allow himself to bask in it for long. There were still stories like the young black woman's, still candidates who needed Bright Edge to be more than a logo on a skyscraper. As Jason walked back to his office that evening, the city skyline glowing in the distance, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that Bright Edge was finally living up to its name.